and the Conservatives have no plan. That is not the solution.
Debate, the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you as well to my colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary, who's given me this opportunity to do a short speech on today's motion. Thank you very much.
Here for the full day of debate. Let me break down what the supply motion for today from the Conservative Party deals with. It posits that we have a carbon tax crisis, and it suggests the solution is to bring premiers to Ottawa or somewhere and have a First Minister's Conference. I'm going to try to address two very large and complex questions in the next 10 minutes. One is the climate crisis, and associated with that, the role of carbon pricing. The other is the nature of our federation and the role of First Ministers' Conferences and what else might work. C'est la première chose à faire pour...
It's the first thing to say is we need to say clearly that we don't have a carbon tax crisis. We have a crisis in the matter of the earth warming, a climate change crisis. It's almost too late. Time is of the essence.
Large climate crisis which threatens all aspects of our lives in Canada, coming from British Columbia, where in 4 days 619 people died in the summer of 2021 due to a heat dome. Those are preventable deaths, but still 619 people died, according to the BC Coroner's Service that studied those deaths. In the same season, we had wildfires that also compromised our health, threatened lives. We had in that fall the atmospheric rivers that were responsible for billions of dollars of infrastructure needing to be replaced, a huge hit to the economy. We also had, of course, on the other side of the country, Hurricane Fiona, lifting houses up along the shore of Port aux Basques and depositing them in the oceans. In other words, we've had loss of life, unprecedented fires that threaten, unprecedented floods that threaten lives. We are seeing a climate crisis that requires that we pull together. Yet, how do we behave? To the question of a First Ministers' Conference, I look at the European Union and I look at Canada, and I think we have a crisis that here, for some reason, we can't even think like a country. We act like a balkanized group of federations that don't like each other very much. We have 10 provinces, 3 territories, and 1 federal government, and we don't have our act together nearly as well as the European Union, which has 27 separate sovereign nation states, not part of the same country. In fact, countries that were, in my parents' lives, at war with each other. Germany, France. These countries were at war with each other, and yet on climate, the European Union, with 27 separate sovereign nation states and 24 official languages, has, from the very beginning of addressing the climate crisis, back to Kyoto in December of 1997, the European Union came back from Kyoto with a collective pledge, divvied it up among all the nations, and started achieving it. Every single one of the European nations more than achieved their Kyoto targets to well below 1990 levels, while Canada continued to soar above 1990 levels. When Putin invaded Ukraine, the European Union said, we better help Ukraine and make sure they can get electricity, because clearly Putin wants them to freeze. It took a matter of weeks for the European Union to say to Ukraine, we're going to plug you into our electricity grid. We can't get Quebec hydroelectricity into Nova Scotia, where the generation of electricity is still by coal, because we can't get Hydro-Quebec to work with Emera in Nova Scotia to deliver hydro, zero-carbon electricity into Nova Scotia. But the European Union, a matter of weeks, and they plug Ukraine into their electricity grid. We can't get our clean electricity from southern Canada up to Nunavut so they can stop burning diesel. Why? We don't seem to be able to coordinate very well. Why? I go back and look at the histories of First Ministers' conferences. We had a lot in the past, and maybe it's not the best way to get action. Look back at the Mulroney government. Action on acid rain was not by pulling everyone together into the same room. Mulroney's genius on this was to get one deal at a time bilaterally. If you're going to shut down the pollution that causes acid rain, they started with the easiest of the provinces, the one that polluted the least but was having a lot of damage. Prince Edward Island, first bilateral deal between the federal government and a province was Canada, PEI. The last one was the federal government and Ontario, because Ontario, Inco Smelter, was the single largest point source of acid rain causing pollution in all of North America. So one at a time, we got deals with each province all the way across, and then the Mulroney government said to the Americans, you know what, we've come to you with clean hands. We've already cut our pollution in half. Now you do the same, and we can clean up acid rain. But still, Mulroney did do a lot of First Ministers meetings as well. If you look at his history on this, Pierre Trudeau had 5 First Ministers conferences, some of them historic. We remember repatriating the Constitution, rather a big First Ministers meeting. Former Prime Minister Mulroney, whom I've mentioned, had 14 First Ministers conferences. Jean Chrétien had 7. They came to a grinding halt under Stephen Harper, who over a 9-year period had 2, one in 2008, one in 2009. The current Prime Minister, over a 9-year period, has held 3. It's not a great record in terms of collaboration, but at least it's far more First Ministers conferences than we had under Stephen Harper. Our First Ministers conference is the way to go. How do we do it? What's the best way to get our country to think like a country? Today, April 9th, happens to be the 40th anniversary of the day that this House unanimously passed the Canada Health Act. I was reminded of that fact by our former colleague and friend Jane Philpott, who's written a book about how we need to collaborate for health care. We don't have a carbon tax crisis. I would say we have an affordability crisis right across Canada, no question. The carbon tax plays, according to every economist, a minuscule role in the affordability crisis. We do have a health crisis. Family doctors are not available to everyone. Is health care a right in this country? That would be a good place to have a collaborative First Ministers Conference. Could we do that? We certainly, again, have a climate crisis. How do we address that? How can we get ourselves to pull together? Because Canadians pull together when the climate crisis hits home. When people are out of their homes because of floods or fires, we know Canadians pull together. We still have no national firefighting force or plan for it. We don't have water bombers sufficient to deal with the summer of climate crisis fires that we can expect to see. There's so much more we could do if we tried to figure out how do we get collaboration to occur. Well, one thing we need to do is to agree that electrifying almost everything is one of the best ways to reduce emissions. And the best way to make that reliable is to treat the grid like a battery. Let more people produce. Let more people into the market. Let Indigenous nations produce solar and wind. Let coastal communities produce tidal and wind power and sell it into the grid. And when your wind isn't blowing and your sun isn't shining, pull it out of the grid. Again, back to Europe. Denmark's excess wind is sold to Norway. Norway takes that excess wind power, pumps it up into reservoirs, and lets them flow down to create electricity when the sun isn't shining in Denmark. This is not rocket science. For God's sake, as Canadians, we know we're the same people. We know we're the same communities. We basically love each other. And we have got to start acting like a country because the climate crisis threatens our kids' future in a real way that carbon pricing doesn't. Carbon pricing, at long last, has gotten some reduction in emissions. But the truth of the matter is that our government in Canada, regardless of conservative or liberal for so long, has been so busy trying to build up the fossil fuel industry and throw them tens of billions of dollars in subsidies that we haven't confronted the problem. The problem is big polluters. We need to address that. We need to move off fossil fuels. We need to do it quickly while we still have time to save our future. Tax the excess profits. So far, Shell this year has had $28 billion in profits and paid it out to its shareholders. For heaven's sakes, This is not rocket science. We can get this right. Let's move this debate to solutions. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions, and probably before we go to questions and comments, it is my duty pursuant to Standing Order 38 to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, carbon pricing. The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes, public services and procurement. And the Honourable Member for Cypress Hills, Grasslands, carbon pricing.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Ultimately, I would take a look at the price on, or the carbon rebate, carbon tax issue is more of a price on pollution. It's an environmental issue, and I think that we lose that thought. And what I'm interested in knowing from the leader of the Green Party is that the best way to illustrate the politicization of the issue is to take a look in terms of what's happening in the province of Alberta. One only needs to take a look at the current Premier. Before she was Premier, she seemed to be of the opinion that we were in the right direction of sorts on a price on pollution and the impact it was having. She even cited a personal example. Today she's a Premier, and she is one of the individuals that have really focused on getting rid of the carbon rebate or the price on pollution. And I'm wondering if she could just provide her thoughts in terms of to the degree in which the politicization of the issue could be very damaging for good, sound public policy.
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And thank you to for my honourable colleague for the question. Look, the actions of the Premier of Alberta are quite baffling because her decision to put a pause on renewables when there's billions of dollars of investment trying to get into Alberta makes no sense. Alberta has the best potential for solar. I mean, that's where Alberta is a real energy powerhouse. The facility that was recently put in place near Okotoks is delivering solar power at less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour and rolled out fast. There's nothing that can be competitive with that. And if we look at solar and wind as sources of electricity, the price to consumers plummets. When the marginal cost of a kilowatt hour is zero, that's why the utilities are resistant to this. Their profit model, their business model, is that they make energy in big mega projects and they sell it along long stringy lines where it loses in efficiency, and they sell it to consumers who have no choice but to buy it. Bring down the price of electricity. Let little communities, let Indigenous nations, let people produce their own electricity with renewables. Bring down that price. That will help everyone, except for some reason the Premier of Alberta.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Madam Speaker. On the one hand, we see a desire to reduce the carbon footprint, and on the other hand, we see investments in the oil industry, notably in carbon capture, which is more or less effective. So would my colleagues see that as a double standard? Should there be more consistency in measures taken to fight pollution and, in so doing, become a global leader, a global example, so that other countries don't make the mistakes that we made in the past? Thank you. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. Thank you to my colleague, the member for Beauport-Limoilou. The Government of Canada makes decisions that are mistakes. The biggest is that there isn't a good foundation. They are continuing with huge subsidies for fossil energy. For example, $34 billion in public money for the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which doesn't make economic sense, and it's a major threat to our environment. And with public funds, it's more than all of the subsidies for clean, green energy. It doesn't make sense.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Buckley Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and through you to my friend from Saanich Gulf Island. I share her dismay that it feels on issues like this that we're less and less a single country pulling in the same direction. The motion before us calls for a First Ministers meeting, and I can't help but feel that the only path towards greater unity involves talking to each other. I wonder if such a meeting were to take place, if the Prime Minister were to heed this motion and call a First Minister's meeting to talk about this, I wonder if she feels that the premiers would engage in that meeting in good faith.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And thank you to my friend from Skeena Bulkley Valley, who, by the way, was one of the few MPs who was able to attend COP28, where the decision was taken to triple renewable energy globally by 2030, double energy efficiency by 2030. These are important decisions that we should be moving on quickly. Look, I would like to think every premier would participate in good faith. We can start naming the ones we think would, but let's start with the evidence. Let's have a First Minister's meeting that has scientists present to explain the real crisis we're in.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Regina Lua.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And it is my pleasure to join on the debate on